Hey y'all, back at it again with another Meatless Mondays, this time from the 15th edition of the Moosewood cookbook. I do have a couple of these sitting around, and as it advances, the recipes do get a little better and there's a little less that I need to change, going from the old recipe to what I really like. This week I figured we'd jump into something as we're getting into the colder seasons. And one of my favorite things to do once it starts to get cold is set up the slow cooker with a soup or a bisque, anything along those lines that can really warm you up. This one is all based around butternut squash. I use one gigantic one, but you can generally use two smaller ones. We're hitting a lot of the flavor profiles of a curry on this one. We do use curry powder, coriander, little cinnamon and earthy spices to also really just warm up the entire body as we're enjoying something like this. A lot of people tend to be scared of soups. They've either made one that they didn't really like, it didn't have enough flavor, you didn't get the right consistency. That's a reason that I really like hearty vegetables like butternut squash. Depending on how much stock, how much milk, anything like that you add, you can go anywhere from a thick hearty bisque all the way down to a smooth soup. I think preparing a squash can be very daunting when you're just looking at the thing, especially if you haven't prepared one before. The technique that I decided to implement with this soup is actually removing the outside skin, taking out the seeds and the guts, cubing it up, and pre-seasoning all the squash before it even touches what's going to become the soup. You really get a lot of a deeper flavor out of the entire dish, which also means you could avoid the curry powder and some of the spices and really go whatever direction you want to go with this dish. It's also very easy to replace the butternut squash with something like a pie pumpkin or any other root vegetable. You could roast off potatoes, turnips, do a really hearty full root vegetable, or just stick with squash, mushrooms, onions, how I have it laid out for you here. I think soups aren't that scary once you know what you're going for. Once you get the consistency you want, the deepness of flavor that you want, I think you'll be able to find that they aren't as scary as they are the first couple times you make them. Let's get into this. Like stated in the intro, we're going to do something a little different for preparation of squash than what most recipes claim. We're going to go ahead and peel down all the way past these green ribs that are on the outside of a butternut squash. This recipe calls for 2 medium size, and as you can see, I have a very large squash here, so I'm just going to be using the one. After peeling off a bulk of the skin, we can go ahead and split the neck from the base of the butternut squash. I find it easier to cube up these portions like this. I'm going to cut the length of the squash down to roughly the same sizes, and then cut those down into cubes, again, that are roughly the same size. We're not particularly going for perfection on this. In fact, variety of the sizes will add a little variety of the roast in the finished product. Once the neck of the squash is handled, I like to cut the base off the bottom of the squash and begin to pull out the pulp and the seeds. And once it's split in half, much like a traditional squash or pumpkin, you can just use the spoon to scoop out the remaining guts from the flesh. Then cube up the pieces of the pulp. After the squash is all cubed up, I coat the squash in about a tablespoon of vegetable oil and sprinkle some curry powder over the top. And just mix that really well with your hands. Make sure that the curry powder is coating every little nook and cranny of these cubes. And make sure none of those little pieces escape your hand. After the squash is coated, I put some aluminum foil on a pan, evenly distribute the cubes around, And you pop that bad boy in the oven, 375 for 30 to 40 minutes. This step is completely optional, but since we had a large squash, we had a lot of seeds in there. I went ahead and started to separate the seeds from the pulp to see what I was working with. We end up here with a pretty good amount of seeds. So we're going to go ahead and wash those out with water, put them in a strainer, and rinse them a little bit more to make sure we get all of the guts out of there. And we're just dealing with nice clean seeds. I'm going to spread those across a different aluminum foil lined pan. Add a little bit of salt and just throw them in the oven with the squash. Check on them after about 5-10 minutes. And you should have something like this. Nice and toasty, salty, very earthy, similar to a pumpkin seed. Now for the remainder of the preparation of the soup. We're going to crush and chop 2 garlic cloves. After that, we're going to peel and dice 1 red onion. At this point, the squash has been in the oven for about 20 minutes. I take it out, try to flip all the pieces around, and go for another 10 before I touch it again. To finish off veggie prep, we're going to take a half pound of mushrooms and give them a rough cut. A lot of this stuff, with my version of the recipe, is going through the food processor at the end so we have a nice smooth bisque. So uniformity is not as important in this process. After another 10 minutes, we take out the squash, flip it again, and touch some of the bigger pieces to try and check for firmness. We're looking for a little give, but we don't want them to become mush while they're in the oven. Let's go ahead and give these guys another 10 minutes. Now to prep the remaining vegetables, we're going to coat a pan in a little oil. And add our red onion to that. We're going to let those go about 5 minutes or until the onions become translucent. Then we're going to add the garlic and the spices, which include 1 teaspoon coriander, ginger, cumin, and curry powder, alongside of 1 teaspoon dry mustard, cinnamon, and cayenne powder. We're going to mix that in and let it go until the garlic and the spices start to become fragrant. After a couple minutes, or when your whole kitchen is smelling like a curry shop, you can throw in your rough chopped mushrooms and stir those in. At this point, to keep in moisture and make sure the spices don't burn, I like to cover the whole thing and let it cook for another 10 minutes. After about 10 minutes, I give it a stir and add a little salt to try to help some of that moisture come out of those mushrooms and make sure those spices don't burn. At this point, our squash should be done, so we're going to take them out of the oven, give them a flip and a little press, and maybe 1 for tasting. I allow the squash to cool for about 5 minutes and throw it in a food processor with 1 cup of oat milk I just like to go as smooth as you want this soup or bisque to be, and drizzle a little more oat milk in there as your food processor needs it. We're going to add that squash and milk mixture to a crock pot or back to a pan on top of the stove. Then we're going to add the mushroom mixture to a food processor along with about a cup of stock and blend that until smooth. Again, we're just going as far as you want to. The recipe itself says to not even blend this mixture, just add this part into the blended squash, which really adds for a different texture, but it's going to be whatever your preference is. Once that's blended, I add it into the crock pot with the mixture. And give it a good mix to see for consistency how much more stock I would like to add. Here I added another cup, gave it a mix, and checked it in about an hour. Since we've already got some seasoned seeds to go on top, figure we can cut some green onion on the bias to finish this plating off. I think it's not only pretty, it adds a really nice layer of freshness right on top, since you have a lot of earthy flavors going on within the soup itself. For plating, I did a big heaping bowl of the bisque, topping it with some sour cream, pieces of baguette, seeds, and those sliced green onions. It may be simple, but it's delicious. If you like what you saw, don't forget to hit the like button. It really does help us out. And if you want to see more videos every week, meatless and vegan, hit that subscribe button. Come back every Monday for more.